Hello, beautiful community. In this Sunday Q&A, we're going to get a little bit more talkative, a little bit more discursive, and some of the questions might even stump me. Let's begin with the first one. What do you think about the Telegraph piece, the British broadsheet newspaper? Some people wouldn't call it a broadsheet anymore. Following Zelensky's visit to the UK, the Telegraph suggesting that British weapons could be manufactured in Ukraine. Well, I'm not going to say anything military here. Let me say something journalistic, and that's that historically in Britain, the Telegraph and the Times have tended to have journalists with better access to military expertise, because the Guardian journalist is much less likely to have a phone number of 7 generals. The Telegraph journalist is more likely to have that, which is why often left-wing folks historically have gone to these places for military coverage. That don't mean that there's credibility in what you're reading. But when I say that, I'm not parroting Elon Musk. I'm saying that you judge the credibility of a piece on individual terms within the context of what the publication is up to. So we're not going to do broad quasi-conspiratorial swipes about how nothing in the mainstream media can be trusted. Well, much in the mainstream media is damagingly illusory and misrepresentative indeed of political reality in the countries where that mainstream media works. But the objections here have got to be about what kind of shape we want our institutions to have and how to work toward that, not the baby who throws institutions out of the pram and ends up themselves reading themselves on Substack. Back to the question. Politically, that sort of talk, I think, generates 2 conclusions. The first is that there is thinking about this war being very long, that there is thinking about this war being not here just in 6 months, but potentially here in 36 months. That's the bad news. The good news is that this thinking indicates the reality and the perception of the medium-term solidity of the Ukrainian state. And that's one of the remarkable stories of the war. Perhaps the most remarkable story is how Ukraine stood up for itself. But the second most remarkable story is the survivability of the Ukrainian state, that it's held, and that now there is a global perception that the Ukrainian state can hold in the medium term and continue up to a point functioning reliably. So the global confidence in the sustenance of the Ukrainian state and pessimism looking with openness to a potentially very long war. What's the meaning of Solovyov's reaction to Trump announcing his 2024 run? Vladimir Solovyov is a Russian propagandist. He is known to you almost certainly, unless you're sort of new to the subject. A lot of people who are consuming content, but also who are making content, just came to this in Feb 2022. And it's always, interesting what difference it makes that the people who didn't come to it at that point, what they know, what they understand, what context is available to them. Interestingly, Solovyov is a guy who expresses liberal views and who is even critical of the Putin regime in its much more mild incarnations years and years back. And now he's become this. One bit of context. Another bit of context, and I'll come to what Solovyov said in a second. Another bit of context is that since 2014, it's been nearly the official policy of the Kremlin to destabilize from within the democracies that are implicated in the sanctions regime than the much weaker sanctions regime against Russia. Solovyov wasn't criticizing Trump on this occasion as such. He was criticizing Trump for not standing a strong enough chance of winning. But he wasn't saying that Trump is the worst candidate for Russia out of DeSantis and Biden or whoever else. So he was having a go at Trump with a little bit of a kind of residue of disappointment. That doesn't mean we understand exactly what Solovyov said. That depends on what he had for breakfast that day. But what really matters to us is that the Kremlin is very disappointed in Trump, but not disappointed in Trump to such a degree that they wouldn't strategically prefer Trump again. In Putin's words, his disappointment in Trump would be to do with democracy. The fact that Putin's experience of the Trump administration was as an administration that was very tough on Russia, and indeed many experts would confirm that impression, and that toughness was incongruent with the language of the president himself, which had little practical import. And so for Putin, Trump is a kind of walking commentary on the fleeting and ineffectual nature of the office of president of in the United States. And that's how Putin generally sees democratic leaders. Here today, gone tomorrow, can't do much, can't promise much, because they're not going to be here. In a more adequately analytical mode, we can say that Putin's got a point, and that what Trump failed to do to implement his project further was develop an elite around him that could act effectively and collectively. Trump remained a practically discombobulated one-man show. And that's why the deleterious impact that would have been had on US democracy if Trump wasn't Trump, but Trump was Orban, a much more disciplined, much more strong-willed, much more skilled politician who has patience, discipline, holds his nerve. Orban would have been able to push something like a project of shaking up US political institutions much further than Trump ever could, because of that lack of implementation of the elite. And Putin doesn't analyze things like that, but he'd be predicting the same would happen. That it virtually doesn't matter exactly what Trump will say. US foreign policy may not change dramatically. They're hoping that's not going to be true. They're hoping for a change. Having said all of this, as things stand, and we can't teleport ourselves into the Kremlin, but as things stand, that prefer DeSantis to Biden and Trump to DeSantis. This is a fluid picture, and it can change. And do not make the mistake, this is very serious, of thinking that a politician that you dislike or a politician that you find is in some existential form deleterious to your democracy, that they're a Russian agent, just because they might be favored by the Kremlin. So don't jump to that conclusion. So that's what I would say. There's a great deal of disappointment with Trump, but they are just about reluctantly, negatively ready to pick him as things stand today, but that's a fluid picture. Could you share your thoughts on Maria Pevchikh's interview with Yuri Dut, especially her absolutist remarks about other oppositional figures? Maria Pevchikh is nearly the number one face of the Navalny group, except for Alexei Navalny. There are other major faces, but maybe she's the number one at the moment. And she does indeed express very absolutist views about other oppositional figures. Let me try to give us a principle here that's helpful beyond just thinking about this war and the Russian opposition. And it's a principle about thinking of discourse as a kind of economy which you cannot assess except by looking at it as a whole. So, imagine that we've got a situation where it's important to come to the understanding that citrus fruits are bad, they're evildoers. There are going to be people who scream just against lemons. There are going to be people who scream just against oranges. Then there are going to be people who just say, you know what, let's just avoid all fruit altogether, even though non-citrus fruits are not evildoers, not benign. They are benign. Then there are going to be people who pick on citrus fruit but inappropriately add sort of plums and pears. How you assess whether a single contribution is constructive or unconstructive depends on your assessment of the cumulative texture of that economy. In other words, if everybody is screaming all fruit are bad, that is a disaster, because that's going to leave people confused about the fact that actually only citrus fruit are bad. Obviously, I love citrus fruit, I'm being silly. But if 5% of people scream that all fruit are bad, that could actually have a positive effect. It could get people to start questioning their relationship with fruit, which could get them to get better at discriminating between good and bad fruit. So what you had from Maria Pevchikh in this interview is kind of a position that says that unless you're purer than pure in terms of any compromises you may have made in your messaging or how you operated, whether you made any compromises with the regime, whether you made some gaffes and you, in fact, inadvertently or semi-inadvertently ended up playing into the regime's hands, blah, blah, blah. Maria wants to be tough on that. And I want to say that in principle, that's not wrong, as long as there are people who are softer. Because if there are people who are tougher, that's going to be effective at generating a kind of clarity about what's what, and perhaps a kind of a moral clarity. But then there are going to be people who are softer, who are going to be much more effective at siphoning off people who are still a little bit confused and still a little bit unsettled. And you're not going to siphon these people off by coming with a kind of moral clarity which says 98% anti-Putin isn't anti-Putin enough. So there is in principle room for both, and how you assess a statement depends on your sense of that cumulative economy. My advice to the Russian opposition, however, is to hit the damn brake at having a go at each other, which is why that piece recently by Khodorkovsky and Kasparov, I mean, they're like chalk and cheese in terms of how they're experiencing this conflict, how they relate to the Putin regime in many ways. They're both deeply oppositional, but they're very different. And plenty of people love Khodorkovsky, but do not have much time for Kasparov, possibly even the other way around. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the Russian opposition to take collective responsibility for the economy of discourse that all of them as a whole are generating, rather than going on by wishing that you were the only one speaking. Our next question is, how could Putin have been so wrong about the possible success of his invasion? Is this just a case of a dictator being out of touch with reality? Well, a lot of military expertise was off. I can say something about the academic side of this, actually. Academic expertise is incredibly slow. academic expertise is struggling a lot now with this war because it just doesn't work on a scale of months. It works on a scale of, I would say, a decade or more. So, a lot of academic analysis of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is still based on sort of 2014. And that's actually a good thing. I wish we could be faster, but that's a good thing. But clearly, you're looking at what you rightly say in your question, that you've got an out-of-touch dictator. And that's a big factor. And the other big factor is a kind of pathology, syndrome about Ukraine. What Alexander Etkin, the Russian academic, calls a Ukraine fetish. A kind of chronic inability to think straight about Ukraine, even from the point of view of the Kremlin's own interests, because of the degree of obsession with it. So that's something that comes out to an extent in our video on the main channel about the Crimean myth in Russian culture. Back to out-of-touch dictators, I do think COVID isolation was big for Putin. And I mean, and this is what anybody who has got journalistic experience of a tyranny, a long-standing tyranny, will tell you that tyrants lose the plot and lose contact with reality after about 15 years in office. Particularly in office in such a fluid and procedurally underdefined system, like the Russian political system. And, just look at, on a much more benign scale, Western politicians being out of touch with what's going on in their own country, right? I mean, I don't know, I'm in Britain. There are really key socioeconomic or public health or other issues in Britain that 12 out of the 600 MPs in Parliament have a proper hold on, have been properly briefed on, have properly looked into. So that's a problem. Politicians in the most stable and democratically sound countries in the world have problems with the sense of reality about what's happening in their own country at the time. You magnify that by 1,000 when you've got a regime where institutions do not function, where there is no journalistic work, so you can't rely on that for information, where all kinds of processes are sort of semi-privatized, enormously corrupt, functionally corrupt, where it's not clear what is whose responsibility, where there's all kind of competition under the carpet between different agencies. So in a regime like that, you cannot avoid progressively, if you like, monitors to planet Earth being turned off. It's inevitable. And, one of the things we've got to worry about is that as the story goes on, Putin's monitors to planet Earth may be further going to turn off. Next question. This stumps me, actually. What's the best thing to say about the position on the war of what you call the depoliticized blob in the middle? So these are people who have, as we've put it, outsourced politics to the Kremlin, and they are neither for nor against what the Kremlin is doing. They just feel that the Kremlin will do politics for them, and fingers crossed that's not going to end up badly. And of course it has ended up badly, has ended in disaster, and it's very difficult to face that disaster. And that's the disaster that's truly difficult to face, more than the reality of the war itself. You claim that these people, the depoliticized blob, are not for or against the war. Is this possible Or is it more complex? Is it possible that they're neither for or against the war? Well, it's impossible in the sense that that's a simplification, obviously. And that we're talking about a kind of evasion of reality there that is about something sort of entering your subconscious but staying there, kind of pushed into a corner. And that's how a lot of people look away from the war, and that's how a lot of people don't even acknowledge that the war is happening. I think that has been fast changing in recent months, but there are still a lot of Russians who would think that the idea that there is a war going on is itself some kind of a theory. I would say I want to go in two directions here to be sort of brief, maybe helpful, maybe unhelpful. On the one hand, it's a fascinating exploration of how such a voicelessness come about. Why are all of these people there without a political voice? And I want to say it's a deeper story than just a case of simply outsourcing politics to the Kremlin. There's a kind of a great alienation that has never been overcome between the population on that territory and the regimes that have run that territory. That the two are way more alien vis-a-vis one another than any kind of equivalent relationship between a government and its subjects in the West. And there's a sense in which the regime is itself a kind of alien force that just happens to run things here. And it runs us, now it wants to run the Ukrainians, I mean, whatever, I don't know, we don't know. So it's a fascinating conversation about not just people putting down their responsibility, but also about sort of deeper processes that have brought about this extraordinary voicelessness. But however we tell that story, this is the second bit I want to say, your ethical responsibility don't go away. Even if you didn't consciously do anything to bring about this war, you, in virtue of being a Russian citizen, are ethically involved. You're not ethically guilty, you're not ethically to blame, but you're ethically involved. Responsibility by association. Not guilt by association, responsibility by association. That blob in the middle is ethically unlucky, if you like, to be ethically tainted. They do not get to ethically walk away from this situation. They're completely ethically implicated. They're responsible for Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine. And their distance from this whole story and their propensity to protect that distance at all costs is a part of their ethical tragedy.